My name is Lauren Hayes. I'm 29 years old, and this is the story of how my family tried to write me out of my own life. At a family meeting after my grandfather passed, my relatives smirked and told me, "You know this money belongs to us, not you." They thought I'd roll over like I always did. They thought I was the same quiet and visible girl they'd always known. But then the will was read, and everything changed. And before I tell you how everything flipped, like and subscribe and drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from. Growing up in Raleigh, North Carolina was like living in a perpetual shadow. It wasn't a dark, scary shadow, but a soft, gray one, the kind that blurs your edges until you're not sure where you end and the background begins. My family home was comfortable, the neighborhood was leafy and quiet, but the air inside was thick with comparisons. My parents, Frank and Patricia Hayes, were good at providing. We had food, clothes, a roof over our heads. What they weren't good at was seeing me. My world was defined by my older cousins, especially my Uncle Richard's children, Megan and Kyle. They were the suns around which my parents' universe seemed to orbit. Megan was loud, athletic, and charmingly manipulative. Kyle was the smart one, the one destined for law school, the one who could do no wrong. They were the benchmark, and I was the quiet, disappointing footnote. I remember one Saturday afternoon when I was about 10 years old. I had just won the county-level science fair. My project was on the effects of different soils on plant growth, a project I'd spent weeks on, carefully tending to my little bean plants, documenting their progress in a notebook with neat, careful handwriting. I came home clutching a big blue ribbon, my heart thumping with a shy pride I could barely contain. I walked into the living room where my parents were having coffee with my Uncle Richard and Aunt Carol. Megan was there too, spinning in circles in the middle of the room, showing off her new soccer jersey. "I won," I said softly, holding up the ribbon. My mother glanced over. "Oh, that's nice, honey. Look, Megan got her uniform for the new season. Isn't it great? She's going to be the star player this year." My father grunted from behind his newspaper. "Science fair, huh? Well, try not to make a mess with all that dirt." Uncle Richard laughed. "Ha ha ha! That's my girl," he said, pointing to Megan. "She's a doer, not a thinker. Born for the field." My blue ribbons suddenly felt flimsy and cheap. I quietly went to my room and tucked it into a drawer behind my socks. It was the first of many moments where I learned that my achievements were silent, personal things, not meant for family display. Megan's team lost nearly every game that season, but at every family dinner, they celebrated her fighting spirit. My final report card, filled with straight A's, was met with a simple, "Good, keep it up." The message was clear. My successes were expected and uninteresting. Theirs were events. Even Kyle, the brilliant one, was part of this dynamic. In our junior year of high school, we were in the same advanced chemistry class. I loved the order of it, the logic. Kyle hated it and was on the verge of failing, which would have ruined his perfect academic image. He came to me one week before a huge exam, practically begging for help. "Lauren, you have to tutor me," he'd whispered so his friends wouldn't hear. "If I fail this, my dad will kill me." So I spent every evening for a week at the library with him, patiently explaining molecular bonds and stoichiometry. I made flashcards for him. I walked him through practice problems until he finally understood. He ended up getting a B+ on the exam. I got an A. At the next family dinner, my uncle stood up and raised a glass. "To Kyle," he boomed. "Pulled a B+ in that chemistry class they say is impossible. The boy's a natural genius." Kyle just sat there, soaking in the praise, a smug little smile on his face. He didn't even look at me. When my mother asked about my grade and I told her I got an A, she just patted my hand and said, "Well, of course you did, dear. You've always been a good little student." My hard work was an expectation. His was a triumph. I learned then that my role was to be a supporting beam, invisible, but useful for holding up the people who actually mattered. This dynamic became even clearer during the holidays. Christmas at our house was a showcase for my cousin's accomplishments and my parents' approval of them. One year, when I was 17, I'd worked for months at a local bookstore to save up money. I bought my father a rare first edition book by his favorite history author, and my mother a delicate antique silver locket she'd once admired in a shop window. I was so proud of the thought I had put into them. On Christmas morning, I watched as they opened my gifts. "Oh, a book," my father said, giving it a cursory glance before placing it on the end table. "Thank you, Lauren." My mother opened the locket and gave a thin smile. "It's very, old-fashioned, dear. Thank you." Moments later, Megan presented her gifts. She gave my father a new, expensive golf driver and my mother a designer handbag. My Uncle Richard had obviously paid for them, but they were flashy and impressive. My parents' reactions were like night and day. My father jumped up, swinging the club, his face alight with excitement. My mother squealed, clutching the purse to her chest as if it were a priceless treasure. "Oh, Megan, you shouldn't have," she gushed. "You just have such wonderful taste." I sat on the couch, the wrapping paper at my feet, feeling like evidence of my failure to impress, to matter. The only person who saw the color and shape of me was my grandfather, Thomas Hayes. Grandpa was a Vietnam veteran, a man who had built a successful logistics company from the ground up with little more than an old truck and a will of iron. He was quiet, like me, but his silence was different. It wasn't the silence of being overlooked. It was the silence of observation, of thought. His hands were calloused from a lifetime of work, but his touch was always gentle. He lived in a modest single-story house on a few acres of land just outside the city. That house was my sanctuary. While my parents and cousins were at soccer games or shopping malls, I was with Grandpa in his garden or in his workshop, a place that smelled of sawdust and old oil. He didn't just talk to me, he listened. He would ask me about my science projects, about the books I was reading, about what I thought about the world. When it came time to apply for college, my parents had been typically dismissive. "Just go to the local community college, Lauren," my father had said. "It's practical. No sense in spending all that money when you'll probably just end up in a simple office job anyway." I was heartbroken. I had my sights set on the state university's accounting program. Feeling defeated, I took my application papers to Grandpa's house that Sunday. He sat me down at his heavy oak kitchen table, put on his reading glasses, and went through every line with me. He didn't just glance at it. He read it. "You have excellent grades, Lauren," he said, tapping a finger on my transcript. "And your essay here, it's good. It's clear. You've got a good head on your shoulders." He looked at me over his glasses. "Your father's a cautious man. Too cautious. He sees the world in terms of risk. I see it in terms of opportunity. You are an opportunity. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." He leaned back in his chair. "When I started my business, everyone told me I was a fool, said I was risking what little I had. Your own father told me to just keep driving for the other guy, collect a steady paycheck. But I had a plan. I was quiet about it. I worked hard when no one was watching, and I was patient. That's the key." They called me the quiet one who won't go far. I confessed to him that afternoon, the old hurt bubbling up. He nodded slowly. "Good. Let him think that. Quiet isn't a weakness, Lauren. It's a power. You see things other people are too busy talking to notice. You listen." He smiled, a rare, warm thing. "And don't you ever confuse volume with value. A lion's roar is loud, but it's the silent hunt that feeds the pride. One day, you'll understand that strength doesn't need applause, it needs patience." He co-signed my student loan application that day. Without his support, I never would have gone to the university. Without him, I wouldn't be who I am. Those words, that belief in me, became my shield. I held them close through every family gathering where I was an afterthought. I worked hard to be self-sufficient, not because I was taught to be, but because he showed me I could be. When he passed away peacefully in the sleep at the age of 86, a part of my world collapsed. I got the call from my father early one morning. His voice was flat, matter of fact. "Your grandfather's gone. Passed last night. The funeral's on Friday." No comfort, no kindness, just a transmission of information. The days between his passing and the funeral were a strange, hollow limbo. The night after he died, I drove to his house. The family wasn't there yet. They were making arrangements, which I knew really meant they were on the phone with each other speculating. I let myself in with the spare key he'd given me years earlier. The house was still and silent, smelling of him, a faint mix of coffee, sawdust, and old spice. I walked through the rooms, my hand trailing along the back of his armchair. In his bedroom, I found a small, wooden box on his dresser. It wasn't locked. Inside were not valuables, but memories. A ticket stub from a baseball game we had gone to, a dried rose from his garden, a photograph of my grandmother, and a small, folded-up piece of paper. It was a letter I had written him from my dorm room during my first year of college, thanking him for believing in me. The fact that he had kept it, that it was important enough to save, brought the first wave of real, gut-wrenching tears. This was the man they were about to carve up. This was the love they would never understand. The funeral was a surreal affair. The church was full, a testament to the respect my grandfather had commanded in the community. But sitting in the family pew, I felt a chilling disconnect. My family put on a good show of sorrow. My mother dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue. My Uncle Richard stood and gave a eulogy full of grand, empty words about a man he barely spoke to in the last decade of his life. I was the only one crying real tears, and it made me feel like an outsider at my own grandfather's farewell. During the reception afterwards, I overheard my uncle talking to one of his business associates. "It's a shame, a real shame," Richard was saying, shaking his head with performative sadness. "But he had a good run, and he was very successful. The land alone has to be worth a couple of million." My stomach turned. They weren't mourning, they were appraising. The man who had been the anchor of my life was to them just a collection of assets. A few days later, my uncle called for a family meeting. He said it was to discuss the way forward before the official will reading. I knew what it was really about. It was about them laying claim to everything, about making sure the quiet one knew her place. We gathered in Grandpa's living room. It felt like a violation to be there for that reason. I sat in my grandfather's worn armchair, the fabric soft beneath my fingers. My uncle, Richard, stood by the fireplace, assuming the role of patriarch. Aunt Carol made small talk about the weather, while Kyle talked loudly about the rising cost of law school tuition, a not-so-subtle hint about his financial needs. My parents hovered near the doorway, looking uncomfortable but compliant. Richard cleared his throat, and the room fell silent. "All right," he began, his tone condescendingly gentle. "We're all grieving, but we need to be adults about this, practical." He looked directly at me, his eyes holding no warmth. "Lauren, we all know how much Thomas loved you, but he was an old-fashioned man, a family man. He would have wanted his estate, his legacy, to stay within the core of the family, to benefit everyone." I just looked at him, my heart starting to beat a little faster. He continued, leaning forward and placing his hands on the mantelpiece. "Let's be adults here, Lauren. Everyone knows Grandpa's estate was meant for the family. You don't need anything. You'll get a small check, of course, a little something to remember him by, and that'll be it." A small check. The words hung in the air, a blatant dismissal of my entire relationship with my grandfather. My cousin Megan, perched on the arm of the sofa, smirked. It was a familiar, cruel expression I had seen 1,000 times. "Dad's right," she chimed in, her voice dripping with false concern. "Besides, Dad says you don't have the brains to handle real money anyway. You'd probably just lose it." I flinched. The insult was so casual, so confident. I looked to my parents for support, for any sign of defense. My father stared intently at the carpet, refusing to meet my eyes. My mother, Patricia, shifted uncomfortably. She wouldn't look at me either, but she muttered, just loud enough for me to hear, "It's better if the assets stay with your uncle. You wouldn't know what to do with them." That was the deepest cut. My own mother siding with them, erasing me from the equation. She was agreeing that I was incompetent, that my connection to the man who had practically raised my spirit meant less than their greed. I sat there in that armchair, the fabric that once felt like a hug now felt like a trap. They took my silence as agreement, as the weakness they had always perceived in me. They moved on, talking about selling the land, liquidating the shares, their voices growing more excited. It was a systematic dismantling of my worth, performed by the very people who were supposed to build me up. Deep down, beneath the hurt, a single memory sparked. It was my grandfather's voice, calm and steady in my mind. "The truth will protect itself when the time comes," he'd told me once. I held on to that thought. It was a tiny flicker of light in a vast, dark room. The drive home was a blur. When I got back to my small apartment, the silence was deafening. I sank onto my sofa, replaying their words. For a few days, I floundered. I called in sick to work, unable to face the world. I thought about calling my mom, about pleading with her to see reason, to remember that I was her daughter. I picked up the phone 3 times, and 3 times I put it down, knowing it would be useless. Her allegiance was clear. On the 3rd night, feeling lost, I pulled out an old photo album. I flipped past the posed, awkward family portraits until I found the pictures of just me and Grandpa. There we were, fishing at the lake. There we were, covered in flour, baking a lopsided cake in his kitchen. And there I was, age 7, proudly holding up a tomato from his garden, his large, gentle hand resting on my shoulder. He had always been there. He wouldn't have left me defenseless. He would have known this would happen. A new resolve settled in my bones. I would not fight them. I would not plead. I would do what he taught me. I would be patient. The morning of the will reading, a nervous energy hummed through me. I chose my outfit carefully, a simple, dark blue dress, professional and understated. I wanted to look like myself. Invisible, maybe, but present. I was the first to arrive at the lawyer's office. I sat in the waiting room, my hands clasped in my lap. The rest of the family arrived together, a united front, laughing quietly amongst themselves. They saw me, and the conversation stopped for a beat. My uncle gave me a tight, dismissive nod. Megan shot me a look of pity mixed with triumph. We were led into a conference room with a long, polished mahogany table. I chose a seat at the far end, instinctively retreating to my usual position. They all sat together at the other end, leaving a telling gap of empty chairs between us. "Once this is done, we'll sell the land and split it," I heard my uncle whisper to Megan, loud enough for me to hear. The lawyer, a man named Mr. Abernathy, finally entered. He was in his 60s, with a kind face but serious eyes. He had been my grandfather's lawyer and friend for over 30 years. He nodded gravely to all of us and took his seat at the head of the table. "Good morning," he said. "We are here today for the reading of the last will and testament of Thomas Hayes. I want to offer my personal condolences. Thomas was a fine man." My uncle cleared his throat impatiently. Yes, he was. Can we get on with it, please?" Mr. Abernathy gave him a cool look. He opened the envelope and unfolded the document. The room was utterly silent, filled with a palpable, greedy anticipation. "I, Thomas Hayes," Mr. Abernathy began, "being of sound mind and body, do hereby declare this to be my last will and testament." He went through the standard legal preamble. Then he got to the bequests. "To my son, Frank Hayes, and my daughter-in-law, Patricia Hayes, I leave the sum of $25,000. May you use it more wisely than you have used the opportunities already given to you." I saw my mother flinch, a pittance compared to what they were expecting. My father's face hardened. "To my son-in-law Richard and his wife Carol, I also leave the sum of $25,000. Richard, you always had an eye for business, but you often failed to see the value in people. My uncle's confident smirk vanished. He sat bolt upright, his face turning a blotchy red. To my grandchildren, Megan and Kyle, I leave $25,000 each to be used for whatever they wish. It is my hope they learn that entitlement is not an inheritance. Megan's mouth fell open. The smug whispers were gone. Mr. Abernathy paused, letting the words sink in. Then he continued, his voice steady. All the rest, residue, and remainder of my estate I give, devise, and bequeath as follows. He took a breath. This was it. First, my home and all the land attached to it, I leave solely and entirely to my granddaughter, Lauren Hayes. A collective gasp went through the room. I felt my own breath catch. The house. My sanctuary. It was mine. Second, Mr. Abernathy continued, all of my shares in the Hayes & Sons Logistics Company, valued at approximately $2.3 million, I leave solely and entirely to my granddaughter, Lauren Hayes. Another shockwave. $2.3 million. The number was so large, it didn't feel real. Third, I have established an educational and charitable trust to be funded by the remainder of my cash assets in the amount of $1.5 million. This trust is to be managed and directed by a single trustee, my granddaughter, Lauren Hayes. Mr. Abernathy put the will down and read from a final separate note my grandfather had attached. His voice filled the silent room. To my granddaughter Lauren, who showed me loyalty, respect, and care when others only came around for favors, I leave the bulk of my estate. She has never asked for anything, and so I give her everything. She has the patience, the intelligence, and the heart to be a steward of what I have built. She is my true legacy. The silence that followed was heavy and suffocating. My Uncle Richard slammed his fist on the table. "This can't be right," he roared. "He promised me the land." Megan hissed at me. "You manipulated him. This isn't fair." Then my mother's thin, reedy voice. "Lauren, you can't possibly keep all this. You should do the right thing and share." In that moment, a part of me that had been quiet for 29 years finally found its voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't angry. It was just clear. I looked directly at my mother, then at the rest of their furious, disbelieving faces. "The will was his decision," I said, my voice steady, "not mine, and I won't undo his wishes." I stood up. My legs felt surprisingly strong. I nodded to Mr. Abernathy, turned, and walked out of the room, leaving them behind with the shattered pieces of their greed. As I walked through the lobby, I could hear my uncle's raised voice begin to echo from the conference room, followed by Mr. Abernathy's calm, firm monotone. I didn't need to hear the words. I knew what they meant. The fight was over before it began. The weeks that followed were a siege. The first call came from my uncle. "You're making a very big mistake, Lauren. We can drag this through the courts for years." "Mr. Abernathy assured me the will is airtight, Uncle Richard," I replied calmly. "If you want to waste your money challenging it, that's your decision." Then I hung up. Next came my mother, the call I had been dreading most. She didn't yell. She used the voice of a deeply wounded mother, a voice I had been programmed my whole life to respond to. Lauren, I don't understand how you could be so selfish, she began, her voice thick with manufactured tears. You're tearing this family apart. We are your family. Your father is so disappointed in you, he can hardly speak your name. Were you looking out for me at that meeting, Mom? Were you disappointed in them when they decided I deserved nothing? That was different, she stammered. We were just talking, trying to figure out what was best for everyone. No, I said, the clarity I felt in the lawyer's office returning like a steel rod in my spine. The conversation is over, Mom. I ended the call before she could reply. My hand was shaking, but my heart was steady. Megan took to social media. She posted a photo of her and my grandfather from years ago with a long, rambling caption about how true family isn't about money and how sad it is when one person's greed can tarnish a good man's memory. She didn't name me, but she didn't have to. Comments flooded in from distant relatives and family friends. So true, Megan. Your grandpa loved you all so much. Thinking of you, honey. Some people are just shameless. It stung seeing their public performance of grief used as a weapon against me. For a moment, I wanted to fight back, to post the truth. But I remembered Grandpa's words about volume and value. I blocked her. I blocked all of them. I refused to play their game. A week later, I ran into my Aunt Carol in the grocery store. She cornered me in the cereal aisle, her face a mask of false sympathy. Lauren, dear, we're all so worried about you. This money, it's a huge burden. Richard was only trying to help you. I simply looked at her, then at my shopping cart. I'm fine, Aunt Carol. Thank you for your concern. I pushed my cart past her without another word. Her mouth hung open, surprised by my lack of engagement. The first real step into my new life was a meeting with the board of Hayes and Sons Logistics. Mr. Abernathy had arranged it. I walked into the boardroom terrified. It was a group of 6 men, all over 60, all of whom had known my grandfather for decades. They looked at me with expressions ranging from pity to outright skepticism. I didn't try to act like I knew everything. I just listened. I listened as they discussed quarterly earnings, fuel costs, and driver shortages. I took notes. And because I wasn't trying to prove myself, I noticed something in the financial reports that they seemed to be glossing over. A recurring maintenance cost that was significantly higher than industry standard. Toward the end of the meeting, the CEO turned to me. Well, Miss Hayes, do you have anything to add? His tone was patronizing. I took a breath. Yes, actually, I said, my voice clearer than I expected. On page 12 of the quarterly report, the fleet maintenance costs seemed disproportionately high. I know from my accounting background that our cost per mile is about 15% above average. Are we using a single supplier for parts? I think we could increase our margins significantly by rebidding that contract. The room went silent. The men looked at each other, then back at me. The CEO's patronizing smile was gone. That's a very sharp observation, Miss Hayes, he said slowly. We'll look into it. I had not been loud. I had been patient. And for the first time in a boardroom, I felt my grandfather's legacy settle comfortably on my shoulders. My biggest challenge and greatest comfort was the house. I spent weekends there, slowly sorting through a lifetime of memories. In his workshop, I found a box of his old journals. I spent hours reading them. He wrote about his disappointment in his son and brother-in-law. Frank follows, he doesn't lead. And Richard only leads in the wrong direction. They see value only in dollars, not in character. I worry about them, but I don't worry about Lauren. She has a compass. Reading that felt like he was giving me permission, like he was telling me he knew I could do this. I established the Thomas Hayes Vocational Scholarship. At the small ceremony to announce it, I gave a short speech. My grandfather believed in the power of quiet work, I said. He believed that strength didn't need applause. This scholarship is for the students who understand that, the ones who show up, do the work, and build their futures with patience and skill. I felt a sense of peace I'd never known. I was no longer a footnote. I was a legacy. About a year later, the final test came. My Uncle Richard's business had failed, a result of a few reckless decisions. He showed up at my front door one evening, looking smaller and older than I'd ever seen him. He was humbled, broken, and there for one reason. He shuffled his feet on the welcome mat my grandfather had laid down 30 years ago. "Lauren, I, I know we had our differences. I said some things I shouldn't have." He tried to look me in the eye, but couldn't. "My business is gone. We're going to lose the house. I need a loan, a significant one, just to get back on my feet." I looked at the man who had tried to cheat me, who had called me brainless, who had dismissed my entire existence. I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly replaced by the cool, hard-earned clarity of the past year. "Why would I do that, Uncle Richard?" I asked, my voice genuinely curious, not vindictive. "Because we're family," he sputtered, a hint of his old arrogance returning. "At the family meeting," I said, my voice remaining calm and even, "you and Megan told me I didn't have the brains to handle money. You told me I wouldn't know what to do with it, but it seems I'm handling it just fine. Perhaps you're the one who could use a lesson." His face fell, the color draining from it as he heard his own cruel words echoed back at him. He had nothing to say. "I'm sorry to hear about your troubles," I said, and I meant it, but my sympathy had its limits. "I wish you well, but I don't owe you anything." I closed the door, not with a slam, but with a quiet, final click. I was free. I had built my own table, just like Grandpa knew I would, and there was no seat for them. My value was never determined by their applause, and my strength was forged in their silence. Have you ever been dismissed, only to prove everyone wrong when the truth came out? Share your story in the comments. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and join for more tales of betrayal, justice, and poetic revenge, because sometimes silence is the strongest answer.